What's up, guys? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today is Bryan and myself, and we're going to talk around a lot of different things. Bryan is in the early stages of his calorie deficit. We have some follow-ups on metabolic training from both Bryan and I. We also have a fresh set of comprehensive labs from Bryan that we're going to dig in a little bit, and I'm going to cover or touch on, as a coach, how some of this information can help you with your periodization for your clients, why I think it's important, and some use cases that I have personally and am personally running into with my own clientele, and how we help leverage some of this blood work to help us make decisions. We also are going to talk a little bit around some new research that has been coming out and some of the other podcasts covering that, and some just interesting conversation around that. But before we get into these things, Bryan, what is going on?
Yeah, today is pretty much a day of a bunch of individual updates and then some discussion about some discussions. So we were sitting here trying before the episode being like, well, what's the title of the episode? And we still are unnamed for the moment. So we'll see maybe in retrospect what we should name this episode. But since we had Jordan on last week, we now have a whole bunch of talking to do about things that we find interesting and a little bit about kind of personal updates and stuff like that. So it'll just kind of be a hodgepodge of different things as we kind of maneuver through this hour. I guess first things first, my diet is almost 3 weeks in at this point. It started, I think, the last day of March or something along those lines. And my first week average body weight was 194.4. Second week, it was 193.3. And this week, it's currently trending to 192. So I'm on pace, basically, at this point, 3 weeks in, losing about a pound a week, slightly more, 1.1, 1.2, something along those lines. And for the most part, I am hitting majority of days around 2,800 calories. And then I'll have like 1 or 2 days a week where I just kind of, if I'm hungry, I let myself go. Like the other day, I couldn't stop eating carbs. I like started and just literally couldn't stop. And at the end of the day, I had close to 400 grams of carbs, but still kept my my calories right around that 2,800 number. So within kind of that flexibility of macronutrients, I tend to allow myself a bit of freedom in that way. Like, in a perfect world, maybe my goal is that I want 300 grams of carbs, 200 grams of protein, and 80 grams of fat or something along those lines. And, some days if I go 400 carbs and the fat ends up being 50, then that's cool with me too. So I do follow a lot of kind of subjective signs of just, I'm craving carbs or I'm craving fat or whatever, and kind of let that go. So looking at that total calorie number. And then interestingly, I find that my desire for carbs tends to be higher on days where I train. So, I train in the mornings, and then it's usually that day, that early afternoon, evening, I'm like, man, I just cannot get enough carbs in my body. And then it's the days that I'm not training, because I train in the mornings, that essentially I've used the rest of that day to replenish that carbohydrate stores. And then the next day I wake up and I no longer have these cravings for carbs. So it'll usually shift and I'll have a little bit more fat, a little less carbs on the non-training days. So that's just kind of like a very brief overview of the way I've been structuring it through the first 3 weeks. And one thing I said when I first started the diet a few weeks ago was that in the past years, I've always began my deficits with body weight close to 200. It was 199.6 last year, and I think it was maybe a pound more than that the year before. So right around that 200 mark. And this year I started at 195. So I've already got a head start. But the interesting result that has occurred from starting the diet lower is that my calories are lower. So like when I start a diet at 200 pounds body weight, I feel like I'm dieting on 3,500 calories to begin the diet. And then right around the low 190s, I'm like, I notice this shift where calories have to drop. And now I find myself already in that point, in that shift potentially, where now I'm eating like, 2,800 calories, 2,900 calories, something like that instead of 35. And it really is just a factor of my body weight has gone down. So for whatever that's worth, I think that that's pretty interesting. I have a ton of updates, but I'll let Aaron jump in for a second here.
Yeah. We'll talk about diet stuff a little bit. What you said about the carbohydrate, I find very, very relevant and pertinent to the time of training, especially if you like wake up, right? I know you're a big fan of like the liquid carbohydrate, pretty much up until after, and even I think and a little bit after your training. And then the hormonal changes that take place during training and even post training, like your body can, I'm using a very unscientific term here, but it can like suck up carbohydrate really quickly and easily post training. It is a fantastic use case, especially in like caloric surpluses, to shuttle a lot of carbohydrate in at times where you will partition them, a little bit more advantageously. The downside, I guess I could say, is when we are dieting and have a total lower, carbohydrate availability for the day, it's very easy because like you train at 9, right? You have intra-workout carbs. You're going to have some pre-workout carbs. You have your post-workout carbs. It's now what, like 10 a.m., right? And you're probably through 150-ish kind of grams of carbohydrate. Let's say you do another 50, 60, 70 with lunch. You're now, 200 plus. It's noon. And you still have like 8 hours until you go to bed type thing, or even longer. And it's what I find myself as well. So even right now, I'm in a surplus, or not too much in a surplus right now because of my back. But the days that I've been training in the morning, I can easily hit 550 carbs, by the evening, just because I've used up a lot of them in the morning. So great for
you certainly diet
and maintenance, but.
Sorry, I was just gonna say your numbers of carbs are certainly higher than mine. I can't remember the last time I like purposefully hit 550, like maybe in the off season when I'm not tracking or something. But I don't think I can remember a day in the last 3 years that I was tracking and hit 550 carbs.
Yeah, for now, it's what I want to really do is make sure that I get carbohydrate, right, and calories high enough for before I go into any kind of deficit. And I'm, being completely transparent, like I always try and be on this podcast. I have not had a fantastic, like, off season, quote unquote, gaining period between the moves and different things, now injuring my back. And now we're going to be moving again. And in other countries, it's really just hard to eat a shit ton of food how easily it is here in the US. Has not been a very productive, gaining season on my end.
Yeah. How is your back doing overall?
Back is better. I would say around like 90%. I've done some like hip hinging with greater degrees of freedom, like we talked about with the Israel definition, the other podcast episode. But I've done maybe like 40s in each hand, like a dumbbell type thing. I haven't done any barbell RDLs. The pain is gone, but there is like a stiffness there that is generally pretty common to be around. I have done a lot of like 45-degree hip extension. Like that feels really, really good on it. Been able to load like the glutes and hamstrings. It does bother me still sitting down a little bit, like the longer I sit, but car sitting is generally pretty good. So I've just been like taking like the double peanut lacrosse ball thing, digging into the spinal erectors like every single day. I'll put it in like the psoas area, laying prone, dig in there, into the glutes and stuff as well. And just doing a lot of like some different like yoga poses that are really great for like, just putting a lot of stretch through the low back. I'm hopeful in like another week to 10 days, maybe that tightness will be gone and I'll be back to like, loading it a little bit more, but I will be a little trepidatious in my loading in that hip hinge, heavy for probably another month or so, just to make sure. Cause it's something like, I don't want this to be like I did this thing to my back and now my back hurts me,
forever
for a prolonged type thing. So yeah. I'm very, positively thinking that like, this is just going to be something that I will 100% let heal correctly and purposefully heal correctly. So it doesn't linger forever type thing.
That's super mature of you.
I've only learned that from fucking it up so many times.
Are you able to go as heavy as you want on like movements that aren't involving hip hinging now?
I haven't loaded a leg press yet because like the leg press is the one movement, like, so basically, like I said, sitting down, leaning forward, like writing or eating is like the most uncomfortable position. A leg press basically mimics that, but rolled back. So that is the one thing I haven't really tried loading up on. But like then obviously a lot of like extension type stuff, the Smith machine squat, I can load up, really heavy, and that doesn't bother it because my back is pretty straight there. Split squats, that sorts of thing, perfectly fine. But I haven't really pushed the leg press. I will probably add that in this week to test how it feels doing that.
Sweet. I like that. Well, this is probably a decent jumping off point to maybe discuss some blood work here. So essentially, as we discussed on prior episodes, since Aaron and I started this podcast, he's always encouraged me to have pre-diet blood work and post-diet blood work, just as kind of like a way to compare and see how numbers are and stuff like that. And so I have blood work from last April when I started my prior diet, and then I have blood work from this April, from like a week ago, when I started this diet. So I sent it to Aaron yesterday, and I was like, dude, check this out. Like, it's so much better than last year. And I actually don't know if you referenced it as compared to last year, but you did this really cool, like he did a 12-minute video for me where he basically went over line by line my blood work and talked about kind of some of the different elements that maybe I should be concerned with or look deeper into. And so at first glance, I looked at it and I saw a couple things that were like high or low, in range, out of range, etc. But the majority of stuff was in range. And so my first impression is just, wow, look at this. It's like way better than the prior years. And then I even looked at some of the things that were out of range and compared them to the prior year. And even those ones were better this year than they were last year. So as Aaron was going down it, I was personally a little bit surprised that he was as critical as he was. We'll just say as that, like, hey, you should look out at this, like there's this issue here. And one of the things that he pointed out that I think is the most interesting, because it was the catalyst for me beginning to take Element last year, was that Aaron pointed out in my blood work in April 2021 that it seemed like I was dehydrated. That despite the fact that I was drinking, 1.5 gallons of water and all of these things, he was like, there's these things that I'm seeing. I can't remember what it was, something about kidney function, I believe. And you were saying something along the lines of, it just seems like you're not absorbing your water properly or whatever. And so you suggested I start taking Element. I started taking Element. I've been taking it now for a year. I have my potassium, my sodium. I take my Legion Multi. I have all of these things kind of covered. And then Aaron reports to me this year that it still appears like I'm dehydrated and my kidneys potentially are not functioning as best as they could or whatever. So I don't know if you want to expand on that point at all, but to me, that's the most prominent, because I thought that was an issue that I had corrected, and it appears like I have not.
Yeah. So I think and I do not have your prior year's blood work up. I have this most recent set here. It was the estimated glomerular filtration rate. Was that at the EGFR?
Yes.
Okay.
I was on mute.
Yeah. So the one thing I said the particular order of labs we have here is Life Extension's comprehensive weight loss panel, right? Third party, order it, private purchase type thing. What's interesting here is they generally will give you two values. They'll give you an EGFR and then like an EGFR corrected for your Black population, right? Your African Americans, because generally from a population standpoint, your Black people are going to have more muscle mass on average. This is not really the case in Bryan's standpoint, because Bryan has significantly more muscle mass than your average person does, regardless of race. So what's interesting here is they did not provide the other one, probably because you marked it your race is white or whatever when you filled out the thing. So it is lower, and it's low enough to me that's concerning to go get more information, because for someone that lives this type of lifestyle, we would estimate it should be significantly higher. Now, it's important when you're looking at blood work that these ranges that they give you, so there's a couple different types of ranges. Your standard lab work ranges that you're going to get from like your doctor, LabCorp, Quest are going to be what is referred to as pathological ranges. So it is you basically compared to every other motherfucker in America, in these age ranges. And if we make a blanketed statement around what your average American's blood work looks like based on what we know about the generalized, right? This is one of the few times you will hear me speak in generalizations. American it's shit. So what we have is these like are also called like functional or optimal ranges, which are a little bit more tighter bounds for the sake of being optimal, right? If you're listening to this podcast, if you resonate with the things that Bryan and I talk about, you don't really want to compare yourself to the Gen Pop American. You want to be optimal. You want things to be really, really functional. So for someone like Bryan, it's just interesting that the glomerular filtration rate, or estimated glomerular filtration rate, like I said, would be this low. I would imagine that kidney function would be a lot higher. So this to me is something that I would recommend, hey, I would take this to a GP, or you can order further tests to see different things. Unfortunately, with this specific lab work, we only get this kind of one marker for kidney function. There could be, like, obviously we can get some proxies for certain things like your electrolyte levels and that sorts of thing. But it was low enough to me, like, hey, I mean, I review a fair share of lab work with my clientele and stuff. It's uncommon that I see it this low for someone who prioritizes their health as much as you do, Bryan. So it's the first kind of thing that I noted there.
Yeah, I actually just pulled up the blood work from the prior year as a way to compare and see what that EGFR number was compared to last year. And it's actually 4 points higher this year. So it was 56 last year and it's 60 this year. And then last year had the corrected if African-American number, and it was 64 last year. And that was compared to 56. So you would think that my 60 this year might be like a 70 if African-American. And given the muscle mass thing, like, I guess it's possible that maybe it's not super low, but if that number is, we want it over 59, then whether it's 60 or 64 or 70, like, it's still pushing the pathological range, right?
Yes, exactly. And not that I'm trying to like get you scared or anything, Bryan, but it's just something that I would like mark down as like this is interesting. Maybe you have some gene that makes, you more susceptible to diminished kidney function as you continue to age, or it's like something enough that's like, this seems, potentially slightly off, or maybe especially this happens in our populations with those of us who are very regimented with our nutrition, who eat a lot of the same foods. Maybe we're missing something, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe there's some nutrient deficiency. This is more kind of a larger conversation, but also to the point is like, maybe there's a certain supplement that you should just add in pretty much regularly. For this particular one, astragalus is one that you could do. It's one of the few things that have astragalus. I forget exactly where the position of the G goes. I think it's astragalus, but it's one of the few things shown that can actually help repair like the filaments of the kidneys. So this is something that you could explore to experiment with, maybe run 60 days of it, get that test, retest and see if it's higher type of thing. So these are like really great potential situations where targeted, right, specific supplementation based on a contextual situation like we have here could be very beneficial.
Yep. Well, appreciate that. And I will say, just like from my experience, I drink a ton of water and I don't always feel hydrated. Like, I literally just constantly drink water throughout the day and I'm constantly peeing, and I still like kind of have a parched feeling in my body at times. So maybe there is something to that. One of the other ones I wanted to touch on, and I think this will probably speak to many people here, is my testosterone levels. And I'm totally open, being completely transparent with this, because I even talked about it on my story last year. Like, when I first got that blood work done in April of 2021, my total T levels my total T came back at 277, which literally is like at the bottom of the range, because the range listed is 264 to 910 or something like that. So it was 277 last year, and we were just kind of like, hey, let's keep an eye on that. It could, like, basically you suggested a number of different things. You were like, well, it could be like downstream from this, or it could be impacted by, luteinizing hormone and SHGB. Sex hormone binding globulin, right? So then I went and got those extra tests done, and they didn't really shine any light on stuff. And it was right around that same time that the episode with Ben House on Iron Culture came out, all about TRT. It was like 2 hours of him talking about TRT. And one of the things, or a couple of the things he said on there, were interesting, because he mentioned that natural lifters tend to have lower testosterone levels than the general population. And he went into a number of different kind of reasons why. And then he kind of talked about how low T isn't a problem unless it is a problem. Like, unless, you're having issues in your life, like you have low energy, you have low sex drive, whatever other number of factors could be impacted by the fact that you have low testosterone. And so what that really did was it made me rethink things a little bit and reframe the way I was looking at low testosterone. And I went back and found old blood work from prior years. And so I found some blood work from 2012 where my T levels were 330. And I found some blood work from 2016 where my T levels were 311. And now looking at my current blood work from last week, they're 281. So literally, if you look at like the last decade of my life from 2012 to current, they've been between 270 and 330, which is only a 60-point range. And all of that is on like the lower end of the spectrum, right? And then in that amount of time, I competed in CrossFit regionals 2 or 3 times. I had 2 kids. And I've basically been living my life as I normally would without a whole lot of worry about, oh, I have low energy or I have low sex drive or any of these issues that maybe would be prevalent in somebody with low testosterone. And then of course there's well, maybe there is something I could do about this, not going on TRT, but you brought up some stuff with like triglycerides and some of my cholesterol, which I've always had forever, always. I've had low cholesterol. And so my HDL has been within range, which I think is like 50, but you want it to be above 40. So it's still pretty low HDL, which is the good cholesterol. And then you look at my bad cholesterol, and that's also really, really, really low. So when you look at my cholesterol numbers, my triglyceride numbers, it's like I'm at no risk for cardiovascular events because all of that stuff is super low. But you also find these correlations between cholesterol, triglycerides, and testosterone levels. So do you want to expand on any of that at all?
Yeah, I will. So let's start at the beginning and then kind of wrap around. Generally, right, and I notice I'm saying here generally, the higher testosterone to varying degrees, right? Once you're past like a threshold of maybe that like 400, 450 type thing is generally positively not positively correlated with like lean muscle mass, less body fat, generally a healthier lifestyle. That being said, it's never super, super cut and dry. And what's really interesting here is we have Bryan and myself who are kind of anomalies in our respective areas. Bryan has damn near hypogonadal levels of, free and total testosterone. However, Bryan is what I would put in the top, probably 0.5% of, naturals with muscle mass on planet Earth. Conversely, just as in us being super transparent, I have very high fasting blood glucose numbers, right? They're regularly over 100, which is not good. That being said, mine never budge based on my carbohydrate intake. I have spent multiple years trying to get these down. They never really move, and it's never been correlative or indicative to the amount of carbohydrate I have, how easy or difficult it is for me to lose body fat, these sorts of things. So each of us are going to have some of these slight variances, and it's important when looking at things to always take the blood work numbers, right? This objective data in combination with how these things may or may not manifest, right? Like if I said, I mentioned this to Bryan last night when I was sending that video over to him. If I saw this lab work, and then not knowing whose it was, and then you showed me like a picture of Bryan, working out with his shirt off, like I probably wouldn't fucking believe it. But I know, obviously, I know it's Bryan. So there are things that can be correlative, but not always a hard, cut and dry. But more so what I was kind of getting at with Bryan is there is generally a reason why. Because one thing we have here is also on the lab work is DHEA sulfate. This is an upstream hormone of testosterone. Generally, if this was low, right, we would be like, okay, well, DHEA is super low, so there's not a lot of that hormone, which will cascade into testosterone. So that could be a potential, reason why. DHEA is perfectly within range, on the higher end of the range. Similarly, if Bryan's estrogen, right, which we have on his lab work as estradiol, was super high, we might be like, hey, something is going on. You're aromatizing a lot of your, testosterone into estrogen. That could be, indicative of why. Also, estradiol is on the lower end. So what I was basically, pushing to Bryan was like, lab work is fantastic. It doesn't give us the full picture. Something that would give us a full picture here, if it was something that you wanted to explore just for your own, personal quest of knowledge, or to see if if we could get your testosterone up into the 400s, the 500s, maybe even the 600s, is a Dutch test. And what's really cool about the Dutch test is it gives you the different pathways and cascades of the different hormones, so you can see where things either drop off, pick up, are not getting metabolized correctly, or potentially metabolizing too much of. So it is a potential avenue. It's very, very realistic that Bryan could just be an anomaly here. And maybe, Bryan, correct me if I'm wrong, did you say that you were super late to go through puberty when you were younger?
I was, yeah. I was like 5'2" in 9th grade, and I didn't even reach height until like 11th or 12th grade. I was just a little kid, didn't have any hair till 11th grade type thing. So yeah, it was super late.
So that could be something indicative of why. Again, this is purely speculation on my point, but it is an interesting note. But just that, and then the last thing that we talked about there is your cholesterol. All of it was super low. So, I mean, triglycerides were a little bit on the lower end. HDL, while above the pathological range, isn't quite as high as we would like. But then your LDL, right, which is being subjective here and using my air quotes, your bad cholesterol was very low as well. So cholesterol, again, just speaking at a higher level here, is an upstream precursor to hormones, right? We produce pregnenolone primarily, or I should say in conjunction with, off of cholesterol. So if someone is like never eating cholesterol, is super, super, super low fat for a very, very long time, generally also, in correlation with just having a lower total energy availability, will generally eventually affect sex hormone production, because cholesterol provides us a lot of that raw material for pregnenolone, which is generally that mother hormone, which we cascade a lot of our other hormones out of. So again, just something that I thought was interesting. Now, we do know that cholesterol levels, while largely influenced by lifestyle, there is hereditary impacts of that too. So it could just be from a hereditary standpoint, your genes will signal lower cholesterol. We have seen this, before. I've seen this in clientele as well. But just a larger conversation around, yes, the blood work is very, very helpful. However, it's not always the end all be all, because we know that Bryan has basically 10 years now of like 4 or 5 different sets of labs where relative testosterone levels are probably to, I don't know, maybe 7-8% difference over those, maybe a little bit more, but not a large degree. And we know that he has obviously a significantly higher amount of muscle mass than average, significantly lower amount of body fat than average with these, less than optimal numbers. But while it could be fun, interesting to explore any potential reasons why.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I appreciate that. And just 2 other little side notes. My dad has ridiculously high testosterone. He's like in his late 60s, and it's still like 600 something, and he doesn't take anything. It's just natural. So like genetically, who knows, And then interestingly enough as well, Ben House was saying on that TRT episode that, even if you took a guy that was hypogonadal and got him to double his levels, so say I go from 250 to 500 or something like that, he said that on most people that only is going to correlate to a total of like 2 to 4 pounds of additional muscle mass. So like, I mean, it's relatively insignificant. I mean, when you're talking about my level of training, like 2 to 4 pounds of muscle mass is huge. But in like the grand scheme of how much muscle I've gained over my life, 2 to 4 pounds is extremely small. So I don't exactly know that you would say that's significant on the grand scheme, but it may be significant at like an advanced level. So anyways, like yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say from an absolute standpoint, no. From a relative standpoint, 2 to 4 pounds is great. The one thing, just to kind of throw a little bit of nuggets your way, I would love to see the people that study is done on and their lifestyles, right? Because if it's done, like a lot of your testosterone, like your TRT studies are done on like your gen pop person who treats their body like a dumpster fire. And like, I mean, it's pretty well known. You take your average male and you give them TRT, they will increase muscle mass and decrease body fat without much lifestyle modification. For someone like you, I think it would be a grander effect. That's just my own personal speculation. But yeah, I don't think it's not like you're going to slap on 30 pounds of muscle, but it could be like 5 to 6, something like that, is basically what I was getting at. And just to be super transparent, again, could be completely incorrect. Logic I use there is you take your average steroid user or your, TRT guy, and you take them from 500, being super transparent, my testosterone is generally mid 500s to low 600s. So like a 560 to like 615 range. You take me, throw me on exogenous testosterone, that goes up to 1200, 1500, which is essentially double, maybe a little bit more than double. I will put on muscle mass and decrease body fat doing the exact same thing I'm doing now. So my logic is if we take that, apply that to Bryan, take him from the high 200s into like the high 500s, low 600s, mid 600s, that potential same logic should apply to a relatively similar degree, but could be flawed.
Yeah. I just popped into my brain right now, but in 2012, I also had a blood clot in my leg. So I have a condition genetically called factor V Leiden, which Serena Williams has, and like a couple other big name athletes have had in their life as well. But essentially, it just makes me have a higher proclivity to clot. So since 2012, when I had that happen, I've been on a baby aspirin every day. And given that incident was, when I have my first blood work that I'm referencing with my lower testosterone levels, I'm wondering if that incident itself had some sort of impact on testosterone levels. And the extenuating circumstance of that is that I'm actually somewhat weary of the idea of increasing my testosterone levels. Like I would never go on TRT, and I'm fully open to the idea of increasing testosterone levels naturally through lifestyle or nutrient intake, etc. If we can figure that out. But I am slightly concerned about the idea of increasing testosterone at all, just because with that increase in testosterone does come, higher viscosity of the blood and things like that. So there definitely is like a part of me that's extremely trepidatious, and it's kind of like, hey, I'm sitting in the high 200s for testosterone, but I haven't had any sort of blood clotting issues or even a scare or anything in 10 years. Maybe that has something to do with the fact that the triglycerides, the cholesterol, and all of these markers of viscosity are pretty low. And so maybe it would not behoove me in like my long-term health to actually increase testosterone. So just kind of like a side thought there.
That is a very fantastic thing to bring up. And here's the reason why. One of the downsides of TRT, one of potentially many, is your hematocrit generally will increase. And hematocrit is essentially your blood viscosity. So it's someone like you, Bryan, right? That risk is the relative risk for what you potentially stand to gain from TRT. Like obviously everyone's going to have to make that distinction themselves. But in my opinion, and where I feel pretty confident saying that yours opinion would be, is like, it's not worth it. Right? Because it's just something you would have to monitor a lot. And because of that history of that blood clot with increasing blood viscosity, it just seems completely not worth it to any degree. So that it's really, really interesting there.
Hematocrit is 42 for me right now.
Yeah, generally under 45 is where would be like really, really good. And then again, just being completely transparent, it's really interesting in, this is kind of a larger statement I'm making around males, is we generally do not like to go to the doctor and just like to believe that our health is fantastic. I have a few clientele who before working with me, they had been on TRT for, a number of years. And what's really, really wild to me is the TRT landscape is interesting. It is obviously you have to be a doctor, right, to be able to supply the TRT. However, in my opinion, and for what it's worth, obviously I'm not a fucking doctor. I don't want to be a doctor. All of this information is freely available out on the internet, and we live in this fantastic age of, hey, if you want the information, it's out there. People just won't look at the shit, right? People just want to think it's fine, right? I've had multiple clients, right, who are on TRT. I'm like, hey, you're on TRT. When was the last time your blood work's been done? And they're like, oh, I don't know, like a year ago. And I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, let's go get your blood work done. Their hematocrit comes back over 50. And I'm like, yo, you need to go donate blood, right? Like, this is high. This is your blood viscosity. Your heart is now working harder to pump this blood. Like, you're not 28 years old. You're in your 40s. You're in your early 50s. Like, it's not wise to be fucking around with this type of thing. So it's frustrating for me because like I'm, at the end of the day, I'm just a nutrition coach, but many times I end up being like the push for these people to go get these things looked at, to go actually take action on things that they would have just kept sweeping under the rug, or the doctor that, puts them on these things never follows up. And it's just frustrating. I am getting into a little bit of ranting here, but there's these massive gaps in the landscape of like our Western medical situation that it's very, very frustrating. It's obviously it's hard, and I have to obviously tiptoe around legality, scope, that sort of thing. But more often than not, it's like me just being like, hey, go look at this, please go look at this. Let's just look at it so we know, type of thing. And then oftentimes things will come back not great. And there's been multiple situations where I've like made clients, I'm like, you need to go see your fucking doctor because this does not look good. And if it wasn't for me, like they would never go do these things. So just interesting and unfortunate to some degrees.
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, it's good that they have you and that you can actually send them to the right people. Do you want to talk about some metabolic training?
Yes, let's do it.
All right, cool. Well, let's talk about you, because I see a note here that you're using your back to experiment with a little bit of metabolic work. So how are you implementing it? What's going on?
Yeah, so my prior, I guess I should say current, whatever, training cycle was more lower volume, but like really, really high, really low RIR, close proximities to failure, lower volume, pushing sets really, really hard. Obviously, I injured my back, and even something like, upper back exercise, lat exercises, chest pressing, like everything involves like that core stability, especially when you're pushing really heavy loads. So I realized like, well, fuck, I can't really train this way because everything hurts my back. And, just trying to like brace and keep like anti-rotation was really bothering it. So I was like, this is a great time to explore a little bit of the metabolic style training. I'm going to do the local, or I have been doing more local metabolic style training, and it's just been fun. What I thought was like, this is a great, use case that I kind of stumbled into, is like, if you have an injury or something like that, where it's hard to do like compounds, like a back squat or an RDL or something, this could be a really, good way to still get like what feels like hard, fun training in while you're promoting a lot of blood flow, especially to like that area. So I was doing like, 8 sets of 8 type stuff, or 6 sets of 6 on like a 45-degree hip extension, or a seated leg curl, or something as simple as that, but without like really having to like brace and then potentially re-injure myself or prolong however long it will take to recover from that. And it's just been fun. Like I'm usually in and out in about like 55 minutes, which is a little bit shorter for me, getting like great pumps. My body is sucking up carbohydrate, which has been like really, really fun as well too. And that's one of the benefits, right? You're really just promoting glucose uptake into the muscle with the incomplete rest sort of thing. And I'm like, my heart's beating, I'm getting like pretty sweaty, and it's just like, it can be like a fun pivot away from like, if you're just pushing like, mechanical tension, muscle damage, like that sort of thing. And it's just like more, I feel like it's the recovery is super high. I'll be a little bit sore, but I can train again in like another 48 hours. If you want to go through a period where you want to train a lot because you're just really enjoying it or whatever, it's just cool to now apply a little bit more of the like reasoning behind it into like something that I had only previously experienced from like anecdote sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm actually really excited to get into the local metabolic training. I had a deload week of systemic and then one work week of systemic, and I just did my first session of week 2 today. But I swear I feel like I've been in systemic phase for like months. It's like it's like the most daunting, difficult thing like that I'm just not good at. Because like if you go back to our discussion on metabolic training from a couple episodes ago, the systemic stuff is really like taking big compound movements for different areas of the body, like a push, a pull, and a leg movement, and just doing them as a circuit kind of. And man, that stuff is just really, really hard. I'm kind of glad you're not doing that right now, but it would make for a fun discussion. But one thing, so on the last episode with Jordan, at the very end of the episode, we kind of theorized on like, what sort of things might we see, what adaptations might actually be tangible from metabolic training? Like, are there metrics that you can feel or apply, or is it just like a sense of, hey, this workout felt easier and so it worked or whatever, and it's very ambiguous. So one thing that I've noticed since starting systemic, and granted, it's only been 2 weeks of this, but my sleep has been better than ever. And that's one of the main things that I hear Cass talk about with metabolic training, is just that sleep improves almost immediately. And I was skeptical of that. I really was. And then when I look at my app, which, man, I feel like I've become so dependent on my apps for everything recently, and I kind of hate it, but I also kind of like it from a nerdy data diagnostic standpoint. But my sleep has been way better. Like I've went from averaging just over 7 hours, with 8 hours in bed. So I would basically be up for 45 minutes of that 8 hours, to basically having 7 hours and 45 minutes of sleep for 8 hours in bed. So I'm literally improving the quality of my sleep to the tune of a half hour every single night, which really adds up. And then one other metric that I'm seeing is in regards to my HRV. So, Shantae hit me up when I first started talking about the HRV stuff a couple weeks ago. And I mentioned on the last episode, but basically she explained to me why there's differences between these random readings that the watch is doing for me versus the readings that I force. And she mentioned how HRV is subject to heart rate. So like on a very simple look at it, I think that's confusing. And so here's what I mean. Like if it was just based on heart rate, then you would say, okay, a slower heart rate is better. You're going to have a higher HRV, and a faster heart rate is worse. You're going to have a lower HRV. And maybe on like a 10,000 foot view, that's correct. But I've always been under the assumption, and I think this is right, somebody can correct me if they're wrong, but it's heart rate variability. So my impression was always that it's the difference between individual heartbeats. So yeah, if your heart rate is going 100 beats per minute, there's less variance between heartbeats just because it's going faster. So I get that correlation. But I really thought that it maybe was more along the lines of like, okay, if you're beating 60 beats a minute, you might have a heartbeat that's an 8/10 of a second. You might have one that's 9/10 of a second. You might have one that's 1.1 seconds, and you might have one that's 1.2 seconds. And so this app is sort of calculating that difference between heartbeats. So I don't know what is more important, so to speak, if you can even put it on a pedestal of like, is it your actual heart rate itself? In which case, like, couldn't I just monitor heart rate? Or is it more about that variance between heartbeats that's giving you this reading, right? Whether it is like 1 second versus 0.8 seconds versus 1.2 seconds or something along those lines. So I believe it's the latter, but I don't fully know. But where I was going with that is that it's been taking these random readings throughout the night for me. And so along with me saying that my app is telling me that I'm sleeping better, I'm also now seeing recovery take place incrementally throughout the night. So like I go to bed at, 8 or 9 p.m. and the first reading that it takes randomly is usually between 9 and 10, and it's pretty low. It's like, call it a 60. And then by like midnight or 1, it's like an 80 or a 90. And then by 3 a.m., it's a 130. And then by 5 a.m., it's a 150. And then I take my purposeful morning reading and it's like a 200. So you're seeing this ascent throughout the night of essentially, hey, you need to sleep because your recovery sucks right now. And then as I sleep and as I recover, the HRV improves incrementally throughout the night. So looking at that combined with the fact that my app is telling me that I'm sleeping an additional half hour of quality each night, I just look at these as 2 signs that metabolic training has been working for me at some level.
Yeah, I mean, oh man, there's a lot in there. I think what you said is my understanding of it as well. It's the variation between heartbeats. That being said, as your heart beats faster and faster, the opportunity for the variation, I would imagine, shrinks because it's a smaller window.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like with anything. Also, when you're sleeping, obviously we like to think that like, oh, I'm sleeping, like I'm not doing anything, but your body actually does a lot when you're sleeping, right? Especially like, the turnover of hormones, right? We have this like massive liver process that happens like every night that I can't remember the name of off the top of my head. So I would imagine those sorts of things are why it probably will dip. And then as these things kind of complete and you move into that recovery cycle, it will build again up through the morning. There's a lot of really cool things that I've seen on like the processes that happen, when you go to sleep. Same thing like, hey, you'll go to bed at 198 pounds and you'll wake up at like 191, sort of stuff. So it's
That's
not like
big. That's a big drop.
Sitting there waiting to die, while you're sleeping. Like your body's doing a fuckload of stuff.
Yeah.
But there was one thing I wanted to say there too. Again, tying it back to some of the things we talked about earlier, we know that testosterone, right, is a big driver of recovery capacity. That's why generally you're like AAS, and people who are on exogenous testosterones can train at these enormous volumes because they can just recover from it. Whereas like us mere mortals really can't. We would die under those volumes. I mean, we wouldn't die. We would just get crushed trying to follow that sort of volume. And that's why it's stupid to follow the training program of like your favorite, pro or whatever, if you're, not on the similar types of like, superhuman, supplements, steroids, essentially. But the metabolic training is just more forgiving, right? You're not training nearly as close to failure. Obviously, lighter loads. It's going to be easier from a centrally fatiguing standpoint. It makes sense that you would be sleeping better, right? Because you're going to have less overall cortisol patterning throughout the day, that sort of thing. And then one idea that I had that could be, it would be slightly, potentially expensive to do, but realistic is you could take like a 4-point saliva cortisol test throughout like let's say the final week of like your mechanical tension or whatever previous training stimulus, seeing what that patterning looks like over the course of a day. And then maybe like 2 weeks into the second week or third week of your metabolic training block, and then seeing comparing the cortisol patterning and really seeing if that is a reason, like a reduction in just that stress for why you're sleeping better and these sorts of things. So it could be a cool experiment to play around with and run.
Yeah, lots of different things to do. Got to get a DEXA still too.
That one, I love the DEXA. I think it's, especially now, like you can just compare, hey, what is my lean body mass doing? Another one that I think would be really cool for you specifically from that is bone density. I would love to see where your bone density is like.
I think what I'm going to do is, because I missed the opportunity to get one pre-diet, I think I'm just going to wait until the end of the diet and do one. And then I'll have comparison there before, and then I'll get pre-diet next year. I really wanted to get one before the diet, but given coming back from San Diego and then starting the diet like that day, it just all happened too quickly. So I think post-diet would be a good time, and just kind of expect that bone density and muscle mass is going to be a little lower than it would be, obviously, if I wasn't.
Muscle mass for sure. I don't think I ever in myself at least, seeing bone density go down. The only time I've noticed like bone density was higher when I was doing a lot more powerlifting, which makes sense, right? The heavier you lift, the more dense your bones and connectile tissue are going to be. But I would recommend post-diet at what would be like the end of your recovery diet, wherever you want to like, rebound up to. So that way you can see, hey, I lost approximately, obviously we would have to ballpark this much lean, body mass during my diet. And then you can kind of compare that again to then once you are at the end of like the diet, next time type of thing.
Yep. Cool. Well, I think we have two additional discussion points here. One regarding proximity to failure and one about carbohydrate, water, and electrolyte manipulation. Where do you want to go?
Yeah. So what I kind of wanted to talk about, so I have been really, and we kind of loosely talked about this. I don't know about you, Brian, but I'm seeing a lot of like informational posts on Instagram from people who they're like, well, this study found that like, this happens and this happens. So that means like we should do like X, Y, and Z. And I get it. I think it's great to begin moving in the like evidence-based space and stuff. However, for like, mortals like us, reading research reviews and stuff, or not reading research reviews is pretty okay. Reading research articles is like kind of difficult. And unless you're like really specialized in that or very familiar with that world, like I'm going to look at a research paper, right? And I'm going to see it at face value. I'm like, oh, wow, these people found this conclusion. Like, holy shit, that means that that's true. But then after listening to a little bit more people like, Greg Nuckols, Eric Trexler, Eric Helms, they can like pick apart the research review and then, or not the research review, the research study. And then we'll find something that like, oh, they use, in the example I have here from the carbohydrate, water, and electrolyte manipulation for physique athletes episode of Stronger by Science. We had this really cool, study where they basically tested, I believe it was natural bodybuilders. They're like, they did a BIA body impedance analysis, pre contest day and then like on contest day, and showed like these like massive changes in intracellular size and carbohydrate. So like, wow, these carbohydrate loading protocols are amazing. And then they find out that the equation used was like really botched, and no matter what you did, it showed like these massive change. And then the type of testing methodology that the researchers used is like very limited in its accuracy and that sort of thing. So so there was one part, right? The second one was there's a not brand new, but very recent data-driven strength episode. Shout out the data-driven strength guys who we've had on the show, talking around addressing the limitations of proximity to failure. And then there was also a really, really cool Iron Culture talking around the same thing of like defining failure is really, really difficult. So extrapolating a lot of, hard, that means X, we should do Y, out of these can be like a bit nearsighted because there's a lot of confounding variables, and it's hard to bring like these really strong conviction type things out of these. So it kind of got me thinking like, I've seen this happen like so many times where I'm kind of like now, like if it's mouse research, I'm not really interested. If it's in vitro, which is like the Petri dish one, right? I'm not really that interested. Like I'm waiting for like the meta-analysis and the there's the meta-analysis and the
systematic review.
Exactly. Systematic review. Thank you, Brian. To really, before I'm really like starting to pay attention to like any one of these things, because I feel like often they get extrapolated to much more than they were originally intended for, just because for, us coaches, it's very, very difficult to understand the research at the level that these like other, researchers do. And that's part of the reason why it's like peer reviewed research is so important, because people make mistakes, right? I make mistakes all the fucking time. And I think that people like on Instagram and stuff who are trying to, have great intentions are just hopping on things a little too fast. Then things get extrapolated and popularized or makes to a big account and gets like skyrocketed off to things that really kind of like they might be true within a certain context, but then get misapplied. And we end up with just kind of more misinformation, which we already have so much of.
Yeah, for sure. I want to mostly talk about the proximity to failure stuff, but I do have a discussion for a thought on the BIA stuff. So one of the interesting things that I learned about the BIA, or BIA is the same as those like Tanita scales, or like
It's the in-body, like in the gym,
in body,
stand on it,
or the scales. I mean, they're all using the same technology, right? So
yeah.
So essentially, one of the things that I learned either in this episode or another one I was listening to on the topic. Now that I think about it, I think it was a different episode, but it had an expert on body composition basically. And what he was saying is that when you do those BIA analyses of the body, aside from the limitations that we already talk about exist in that, like, they're very affected by like fluid, whether you've drank water, coffee, whether you've gone pee or poop, or whether you've had any food or any of these things. Like, I even referenced the in-body that we did by the CrossFit gym back in the day, where I was, 11% body fat. And then I went and ate like a double portion of flame broiler chicken and rice, and then went back and stood on the scale like 30 minutes later, and I was now 7% body fat, essentially because my body mass had gone up, right? Which is so ridiculous. But beyond that, which is an obvious problem, especially when you're looking at physique athletes and trying to determine how much of the carbohydrate they're eating is going into their muscles. Like, I don't even know how you can use BIA for that. But beyond that, this guy was saying that BIA basically shoots the electrical stimulus or whatever it is, so like straight up your body. So it does a decent job of getting your legs and your torso, but it doesn't actually like go out distally. So you cannot actually get like your arms and your extremity measurements of your upper body, really. So it doesn't do a great job. And then they also said that it gets kind of confused with all the organs and stuff going on in your midsection. So it could be potentially that it's not even reading like your chest and shoulder mass correctly. So anyway, I thought that was really interesting, and just kind of goes into the further body of literature of like, hey, what is the word, single element BIA versus they have like 2, 3, or 4.
I want to say it was like single
factor.
Channel or single wave or something like that. I can't remember.
Single wave or single channel or whatever. Because you can also do BIA where you get these little things that you stick on your arms, and it actually then begins signaling not just the electromagnetic signal up your torso and legs, but it also can kind of then read what's going on in your extremities too. So anyway, I think that that's just an awful method to be used. And then they said that if you have the science grade one that has all of the little bells and whistles and stuff, then it's better, but it's still obviously not like a DEXA or an ultrasound or MRI even,
No, and one of the things that was really interesting is like, it's hard, I could imagine it's really hard to get quality research on this, because one, you're getting these bodybuilders, like, cool, we're getting research on bodybuilders, but then it's saying like, hey, you've just dieted for the last like 8-9 months for this, natural contest. Let some researcher potentially fuck up your game day protocol for this, research study. And like, no one's going to sign up for that, right? Like, everyone has their own like methodologies and their tips and tricks, or what their coach is having them do. No one's going to spend 9 months of their life, trying to do their best for this show, to have someone test some untested method, on them day of, and then completely fuck up their stage appearance type thing, which I get.
I think that's why this test specifically was done like the day it like measured them the day that they weighed in for their competition before they started carb loading, and then they started carb loading afterwards, and then they did them with the BIA like 24 hours later or whatever before they stepped on stage. So essentially what they were trying to measure was how much of that carbohydrate went intracellular versus extracellular, and I don't know that successfully analyzed that.
Exact gist I got from it as well.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, I think the last thing to discuss today is a lot of this kind of proximity to failure stuff. And what you mentioned was that the DDS guys had an episode on their channel, which I actually have not listened to yet. And then the Iron Culture guys had the one on their channel, which I did listen to. And I also listened to the most recent one that came out on Abel's channel. It was almost 2 hours of him talking to the data-driven guys about this idea of proximity to failure and how far from failure can we really be and still be able to maximize gains, right? And so I always think Abel does like a really good job interviewing guests, and he asks a lot of the questions that I would want to ask too. So I appreciate that. And essentially, when we look at the proximity to failure stuff, it looks at this point like there's a couple things to keep in mind. First off is that you can absolutely make gains really far from failure. The compensation is that you now have to do more sets. So an example, and I put this poll on my story yesterday, is you can do 3 sets of approximately your 10 RM and you go mostly to failure, maybe a 1 rep from failure, something like that. And that's 30 reps hard work. Or you can do 6 sets of 5, which is with the exact same weight. So you're still going to use your 10 RM, but instead of taking each set to the house, you're going to stop each set at 5 reps. So maybe that first set is a 5 RIR, and then it's like a 4, and then a 4, and then a 3, and then a 3, or something like that, right? So you're still working relatively far from failure, but obviously it's getting a little bit harder as the sets go on type thing. Yep, go ahead.
Is rest interval the same between this poll?
Yeah, that wasn't actually discussed in the podcast. Like the data-driven guys didn't address rest time. The way that I would look at it is that the rest is probably slightly shorter. I would say, maybe instead of 3 minutes, it's 2 or something like that. But when you're lifting at heavy loads, which was kind of part of their argument. So to backtrack a step, essentially the argument was that if you're taking a load that is a 10 RM or heavier, every rep is effective. Every rep, even the first one. And so Zach put out an example, and there was a study for this too that I actually read before listening to the episode, where they compared, I believe it was 30 singles at 75 or 80%. So think, you're looking at your 10 RM, something along those lines, and you do 30 singles with a 30-second rest between each single. So none of those reps on their own are actually hard. But over the course of doing 30 reps with only 30-second rests in between, psychologically is what Zach was saying. Psychologically, it's the hardest because you have to unrack the bar 30 times to just do 1 rep, right? And so that's on like one end of the extreme. And then on the other end of the extreme, you have potentially like those 3 sets of 10 where you're taking every set to failure. So both ways can work. And I think even in that study, it was relatively similar. I think maybe the 3 sets of 10 did better than the 30 singles, but it was close, right? And then when you take that way further and you do the 6 sets of 5 at the 10 RM, instead of the 3 sets of 10, then the numbers are basically the same. Like hypertrophy is more or less even across the board. So at that point, then it just becomes a decision on your part of, do I want to do double the amount of sets but not have to work nearly as hard? Or do I just want to do fewer sets and potentially work harder in each set? And so beyond that, like very specific example, it seems that this also then applies or is affected by the type of movement that you're doing. So one thing that we have to keep in mind with the data-driven guys is that they come from a strength background, which means that the majority of the movements that they're doing or that are being tested in the lab are these lengthened overload movements. Their bench presses, their squats, their deadlifts, their RDLs, their overhead presses, and whatever, like a variety of different like lengthened overload movements. And we know what?
You're saying just like compound barbell stuff, pretty much.
Compound barbell, free weight. It doesn't have to be though. It could be a pendulum or a hack or whatever too, and they still fit the mold of like a lengthened overload movement, right? So these types of movements that we know cause significantly more damage and significantly more fatigue, and that are hard from the beginning. Like you and I have even talked about how like a set of 10 RM on hack squat, like by the time you get to 5, you're already like, oh man, I'm in this thing. Like this is brutal, So like imagine doing 6 sets of that 5 versus 3 sets of all out. Like both really suck, but both can be effective. And then the data-driven guys were kind of theorizing that if you're going to try and apply this to movements that are short overloaded, like basically any type of back movement or a lot of arm work and shoulder work, lateral raises, stuff like that, that it's very likely that you can't get the same effect by being further from failure. That because of where the muscle fails, because how much less fatigue is caused by it, because of the fact that you could potentially do fucking 5 sets of lateral raises every day for life and you'd probably be okay, like you wouldn't overtrain, that it's just different. So I think that, when you look at these studies that are showing that it is possible that you can make equal hypertrophy being way far from failure. Those studies are done all on lengthened overload movements. And I'm not even here to argue with that. Like, I think, for sure, there's no reason that you couldn't make progress at 5 or 6 RIR on lengthened overload movements. It's just a matter then of like, just because you can, does that mean you want to? And so at that point, then you kind of have this personal preference piece. And then it even reminded me of back in the day, like 20 years ago, there was a big program on T Nation that was 10 by 3. And you would take your 10 rep max and you would do 10 sets of 3 with your 10 RM. And it's literally the same idea. Like everything seems to be 30 reps. That's like the magic number, right? 6 sets of 5, 3 sets of 10, 10 sets of 3, whatever it is. It always somehow equals 30 reps. So it just goes to show that like, that 10 by 3 protocol, before the science was there to support it, it is now in retrospect being supported, but it's again that factor of like, do you want to do 10 sets or do you just want to do 3? And so from like a broad, very like 10,000 foot view, I think that that's interesting. I think that it opens up the doors of so many different possibilities of ways you can train effectively. And, you can really begin to train for your psychology as opposed to necessarily having to do what said influencer or said scientific study says. You can kind of use the fact that hypertrophy is so forgiving and find the way that you enjoy most.
I mean, I think you really hit the nail on the head there. We know hypertrophy is a forgiving adaptation, and there may be a most optimal way to do things, but if you hate it and you don't want to be there, optimality doesn't matter, right?
Yeah. I don't even know if it's optimal though. Like 6 sets of 5 might just be as good. I
said if there was one. Right? Let's say there was one. I mean, from a relative to absolute standpoint, is it like it might be optimal, but like by what, 1/3%? That in an absolute standpoint, that means fuck all. You know what I mean? So it's always really, really interesting. Like the more I pay attention to the research, like reviews and like the DDS guys and Stronger Science, it all kind of comes back to like, how much does it really matter? I don't really fucking know. And it's really, really interesting. Like I love it, but it always kind of comes back to like the kind of same big principles, right? Yep. Training, with intent, right? Making sure you're recovering, leveraging shortened overload stuff, probably a little bit more of the majority to be lengthened overload, right? Unless you're in like a metabolic style a metabolic style training program. Like the pillars are the pillars for a reason. And then we kind of just get people who go explore these things. We get these scientists and researchers to provide us all this information to, I guess, help continue to validate the pillars, and maybe some pillars over time will kind of decrease in importance. Others will increase. And that's kind of the beauty of science, really.
Yep. I want to drop one other thing that I think you're going to find really interesting. So it's regarding the lengthened piece of the musculature. And I want to say I've thought about this before, but the way that Zach put it on that podcast just really kind of made me think even further and more in depth about it. So he said, at this point in the literature, we are quite confident that there is something about lengthened movements, lengthened overload, training muscles at long muscle lengths that is better than not for hypertrophy. And he said, but what we don't know is whether it's training at long muscle lengths or it's setting the overload so that it's hardest in the lengthened position. And so I'll provide you an example to kind of clarify this. So imagine if you had a leg extension machine that allowed you to get full knee flexion. So you could essentially bring your heel all the way to your butt and then go through the range of motion from there. But in that example, assume the movement is still hardest in the short position. So you're taking the quad through its full range of motion. You're going heel to butt, but it's still hardest in the short position. So that would be training a muscle at long muscle lengths, but it wouldn't be overloaded in the lengthened position, right? Alternatively, think about a regular leg extension setup where you're not getting full range of motion of the quad. So it's stopping where your shin is maybe vertical. But you can set your leg extension machine so that the bottom third of that range of motion is the hardest part. And then it sort of drops off as you get to the short position of the movement where your legs lock out. So he said, we don't know which of those is more important. Is it to overload that bottom position and make that the hardest part? Or is it that you just have to train the muscle at a long muscle length, but it doesn't exactly matter where it's overloaded? And so that kind of made me think, because I guess I inherently assumed that it makes the most sense to me to believe that it is overloaded in the lengthened position, that the muscle is being stressed the most at the lengthened position, when in fact it could just be that you would just have to train the muscle through the lengthened position, which would kind of change a lot of what we do with length and overload movements. It would essentially negate the need for things like length and overload partials. So imagine in the contrary example, imagine that it is just that you have to overload the lengthened position, and it really has nothing to do with full range of motion at all. Well, now maybe the new overload becomes just like doing lengthened partials. Like maybe you never do a full range of motion leg extension. You only do the bottom 50% because you can overload it there and it's heavy and your quads have to work harder to get out of the bottom, but you never really even have to go to the top. So I think you could seriously, if the research goes that way and it says that that's the case, you may have people 5 years from now literally just doing lengthened partials only and not even doing the short position of movements, which would be kind of crazy, versus experiencing, it's just that the muscle has to go through the full range of motion at the lengthened position. Then you still have benefit from the short position. So I just thought that was really interesting, and it kind of made my mind explode for a second.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Made my mind explode. When I finally caught on to how you were explaining it, I was like, oh wow, yeah. But then, like in practicality, like imagine 5 years in the future, you're on the hack squat and you just go like ass to grass to parallel back to ass to grass.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Talk about like hell on earth. That would be just miserable, like so miserable. Zero relief, just pure pain, misery, and sorrow.
Right. But like, where would it stop? Because would you just take an incline dumbbell curl and you would just do like the bottom 3 inches? You know what I mean? So I don't know. It's interesting for sure. My theory is that there is some inherent advantage to the short position, and there's probably some inherent advantage to full range of motion, but I don't know. It's interesting the way he put it. And I'm curious to kind of see more studies come out that maybe explore that.
I agree. It would be really cool to pay attention to. And it's a great, what's the word I'm looking for? A great like thought, I guess, by the DDS guys to just talk about that. It's something like it never even would have crossed my mind. So it's just cool that just to know people and like follow people who think of these sorts of things. So we can just like get the benefit of the cascade of their thoughts and stuff, which is cool.
Yeah. No, I love the way those guys think. Like, even though they're primarily strength athletes, they have just a really good grasp on the science and on the practicality of all of it too. So. Agreed.
Yep. Anything else you want to add on this one, Brian?
No, this turned out to be a lot longer than I thought it would be.
Yeah, seriously. And that always happens. All right, guys. So from Brian and myself, thank you for listening as always. We will talk to you next week.